panel. She was the chairperson and I was the speaker. Now it's time for revenge. So 20 minutes, Luba, remember about this. And we start with meeting with Alexander Sukurov's movies, Mythology and Totalitarian Past, Alexander Sukurov Perspective, Luba Bugaeva. It's your time, please.
Okay, thank you. I hope you can see my screen now, right?
Yes.
Yes. So I will talk about Alexander Sakurov and about his tetralogy, which I see as an example of complex comprehension of historical past, including the Soviet past. One of the dominant forms of storytelling about the Soviet past, claiming to create documents of the era today, is biopic, a narrative about a famous person whose personal history provides the viewer with a window into the past. Increased attention to the biography of historical figures in Russian cinema and television is, however, in line with the general trend of evolution of the biopic genre, primarily in American film and television production, which is a dynamically developing genre right now. The task of biopic is usually to convey the experience of living events, not only within the story as it unfolds, but also in a larger story, to convey a sense of what it is like to live not only in the 20s, for example, or in the 40s, but to be someone who can make decisions and perform actions that change history, if a major political figure is in the focus of biopic, or as well as what it's like to be around such a person. But Sakurov gives us an absolutely different, complex example of comprehension of the historical past, including the Soviet past. His tetralogy began in the 90s when it was made, and it's Moloch, Taurus, the Sun, and Faust. Sakurov shows individual episodes from the routine life of a famous person, of a dictator, or authoritarian figure in the first three parts of the tetralogy. And it's a kind of mythological wrapping up in the last part of the trilogy. Sakurov is not interested in what is usually biopic is interested. So it doesn't bother him what it's like to be a famous person who makes political decisions that influences the fates of the world. And he's also not interested in what it's like to be around such a person. He is more interested what this man is like, and what this man is like is a kind of a typical situation, atypical for a man of power. However, for Sakurov, it's also important to turn a historical figure into a character and the events of his biography into a dramatic narrative, which the viewer lives through. Jennifer Baker develops the notion of tactile eye as a general approach to presenting body or screen. Tactility is mode of perception and expression wherein all parts of the body commit themselves to or are drawn into a relationship with the world that is at once a mutual and intimate relation of contact. Tactile gaze can glide over the surface of the body and make it tangible. This gaze can be kinesthetic, creating a muscular feeling and sense of movements of the body and body parts, or it can be turned inside the body, linking deep inner processes with the rhythm of the film. And Sakurov's camera looks at Hitler and Stalin and Lenin with a tactile gaze. His characters, Lenin, Hitler, Hirohito, acquire a corporeality on screen. The body opens to the gaze and it's a body of suffering, and very rare it's a body of enjoyment. Sakurov presents a day in the life of Hitler in his residence in Bavarian Alps in Moloch, and a day in the life of the gravely ill Lenin in Gorky. He shows in both films the bodily side, the clumsy Hitler coping with his natural needs, urges, the memory-losing Lenin, and you can see it even by the shots that he's a kind of not very active. He cannot take basic care of himself. And also emperor carries out everyday acts. Such camera look problematizes the historicity and symbolic power of this powerful figure, and at the same time it confirms the fact of their existence and makes the narrative about them more dramatic because it shows their bodily corporeal suffering side. By the way, two of the dictators, Hitler and Lenin, are played by the same actor, Leonid Mozgovoi, that makes an interesting connection between these films. Sakurov does not show famous world leader from the bodily side that does not look attractive. When he turns to these figures of Hitler, Lenin, and Hirohito, he chooses the moments of their biography when they don't just look not physically attractive, but also when their power is minimized. Sakurov explains in his interview that his characters, Lenin and Hitler, have reached power but could not really enjoy the fruits of it. So how the director sees them, he sees them as not at the height of the power. He sees that they came to this height of the power, but they are not in full capacity of this power. So Hitler is not shown making speeches, enjoying warm welcome in various German cities. He is shown when he is outside the public in the Alps and he is extremely lonely. The same is with Lenin, who is shown ill, weak, and also lonely. And the same is true about the third film of the tetralogy, The Sun, that takes place during the last weeks of the Second World War and in the early post-war period. And this is the time when Japanese emperor was forced to give up his divinity as an emperor and admit defeat. So what Sakurov approaches in all these films is a private person, not a public one. Though, of course, it's clear that when we deal with politicians, that public appearance, you can't really write it off. And Japanese emperor, the same way as Hitler and Lenin, is powerless. It's not a very good view of this shot, but you can see Hirohito and Douglas MacArthur, the general who oversaw the occupation of Japan. And MacArthur in this episode, during their meeting, dictates the language that will be spoken at the meeting, English, and he dictates the rules to the emperor. And so you can see that he is prevailing in this episode where Hirohito gives light to MacArthur's cigar. In a way, Sakurov follows a well-known principle, the myth of a man dissembled, and he dissembles myth of power person in all three films of this tetralogy. I need to add that Hirohito, critics know that Hirohito is that of a man who appears rather childish and naive. And this is, he obeys orders that are given to him even by the servants. So in fact, he is the emperor and still in the divine status, but he is the only one who obeys the orders and the others don't obey his orders. So the Sun is not politically inarticulate. It's considered to be simply not a political or historical film. And I can say that probably the same can be said about Taurus and Moloch. They are not inarticulate politically. They are not political and they are not historical. Sakurov engages not so much in presenting the past, past, though he addresses the past. He engages in portrayal of the concept of power. The tetralogy is about power. It is a reflection on its nature and on one's relationship to it. The meaning is emphasized and conceptualized, especially in the final part of tetralogy Faust, made in 2011. The underlying theme of Faust and tetralogy is the story of a father figure that alternately appears as Hitler, Lenin, and Hirohito, and of existence in the world lacking authority or in the world without authority, a world without the father in all its senses. In Faust sounds the music written by composer Andrei Siglia. The music sounds during Faust's conversation with the ghost, among whom is Margarita's brother, and during the conversation between Faust and Mephisto in the final shots of the film. I will not show because I don't think it's a good idea. It's a recognizable melody. Maybe you can hear it a little bit while I'm talking. It's a recognizable melody, and it's a variation on themes by Tchaikovsky. However, it's not only a reference to Tchaikovsky, it's also a reproduction of the musical. This is the melody. So it's only the reproduction of the musical theme from Sakurov's previous film, Father and Son, to which Siglia also wrote the music. In the opening shots of the film, accompanied by Siglia's melody, the father soothes his son awakened by nightmares. So this music, which is here and there, establishes the connection between the figures of the father, the son, and it will become the leitmotif of the entire film. And the musical theme from Father and Son, repeated in Faust, evokes and actualizes the father and son theme, but now in projection on Faust and the dead soldiers, on Mephisto and Faust, on the film as a whole, and on the tetralogy as a whole, on which Faust is the final part. In the film's finale, Margaret's dead brother and his dead comrades complain to Faust about the cold and loneliness. They say, we are forgotten here, we are lonely here, and ask to be their commander. They say, command us, lead us into battle. Avoiding the role of Father Mentor, Faust tries to get rid of Mephisto's protection as well, throwing stones at him to teach Mephisto, which claims the role of the father, leader, and mentor, declares, who will feed you? Who will lead you out of here? Who will take care of you? The actualization of the intertextual connection through the music reveals one of the underlying themes of the tetralogy, the story of a father whose role is alternately played by Hitler, Lenin, Hirohito, and the attempt to exist in a world without authority, without God the Father, and without dictator the Father. The final, probably, step right now in the exploration of this concept of power is Sakurov's exhibition, which was held in the Hermitage Museum in September, early November 2020. And it's a multimedia installation inspired by Rembrandt's painting, The Return of the Prodigal Son. I can say that Rembrandt images inspired many images in the third part of the trilogy, The Son, about the Japanese emperor. So in this installation, Sakurov explores the biblical story about the prodigal son from unexpected angles. He says, I see here the story of life. I'm not speaking now of the reflection of researchers, their findings. I'm interested simply in the old man and the son who has returned to him totally different person. Who do we need to think about that today? It seems to me to be very important for me. We are all surrounded by partings, separations, deaths. Here, Sakurov reflects what happened before the meeting, the return of the prodigal son, and he also is interested or he tries to think what will happen after. There is a large mirror where the figures of the son and the father are being reflected, and they look at themselves in this mirror, and you can walk around them and you can see the faces, and you can see that their faces, they are emotionally tense because father is kind of bewildered. He doesn't understand what will happen later, what he will do in his life, what his son will do is in his life after that. And there is also these soldiers who are, it's a real documentary, who are captured by ISIS, and they were burnt alive. And he shows this documentary. And in general, all the images that you can see at this exhibition, they are divided into cycles, 10 minutes episodes. And every 10 minutes, you can see them being burned. And there is also the painting of an old woman, like the mother, and the son stands near this portrait, and he doesn't look at the portrait. He looks sideways because he as if reflects why he was sent to such suffering, what for, and why he should die, and if he doesn't die, what will happen after that. So probably I need to wrap up. By the way, this is also an installation, like you can see scaffoldings, and it can be also interpreted as a scaffolding to create a masterpiece, like an artwork. And it's also scaffolding that represents like climbing to power. In the creating of this exhibition participated one of the pupils, disciples of Sakurov, Alexander Zolotukhin, who made the film Мальчик Русский. And in a way, it's a reflection about their like father and son relation, and also where Sakurov is the father. And it's also a reflection about his father and son relation, where Andrei Tarkovsky is a kind of spiritual father to Sakurov. So Sakurov revisits revisits the past, but he revisits historic past and not necessarily Soviet past, but his revisiting is not limited to the Soviet history. He revisits the past in order to reconceptualize the notion of power, the notion of father and son relationship, the notion of responsibility, which is very palpable in the third part about the Japanese emperor. And he thinks about, and he wants to discuss what happens next in the world without authority. And he reflects on what kind of authority and responsibility we need right now. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. We've got some link between the some of Sakurov's movie, The Sun, and the next presentation, because Ksenia Golovina from Toyo University, which will say us something about Japan, if I understand. Unacceptably Soviet housing in Japan and memorial practice of post-Soviet migrants. So I think we move to Japan right now.
Hello, I'm trying to open my files right now. I hope it works. Just a second. Okay, so maybe it's not exactly the way I expected to open, but can you see my files now?
Yes, it works.
Great, thank you very much. All right. Hello, thank you for the introduction. I would also like to thank the organizers of the conference for this wonderful opportunity. My presentation is titled Unexpectedly Soviet, Material and Housing Practices of Post-Soviet Migrants in Japan. First, allow me to introduce my research and talk about today's presentation content. My research focuses on the material practices of the Russian-speaking community in Japan, including their homemaking, placemaking, and kinship-making practices in relation to material culture and materiality. Today, I will first provide an overview of Russian-speaking migrants in Japan and discuss their materially expressed community building practices with reference to the so-called Sovietness. I will then explore the concept of cultural recycling in connection to the housing in Japan that these migrants occupy or observe. A few detailed examples will follow. Finally, I will discuss some factors that can contribute to cultural recycling and the functions that cultural recycling practices serve. Post-Soviet migration to Japan dates back to the years following the collapse of the Soviet Union and has been growing slowly but steadily ever since. Currently, 17,594 people from former Soviet countries are living in Japan, and more than half of them hold Russian passports. The second largest nationality is Uzbek, and migrants from Ukraine are third most prevalent national group. These numbers are based on data from 2019, and although there have been some changes in population numbers due to the COVID-19 pandemic, it is anticipated that after traveling restrictions are lifted, the numbers will stabilize to something close to their previous 2019 figures. In the online survey I undertook, the top respondents groups came from Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, Kyrgyz Republic, Kazakhstan, and Uzbekistan in that order. Demographically, these migrants are characterized in three main ways: by the numerical dominance of those from Russia, a high proportion of women, and a high proportion of 30-40-year-olds. Many of these migrants are married to Japanese nationals and hold permanent residence permits in Japan. There is an active Russian-speaking community in Japan. Because this community was formed immediately following the collapse of the Soviet Union, shared knowledge and imagery associated with the former Soviet Union were relatively prevalent in this formation. The community itself can be characterized as loosely self-organized around the common use of the Russian language and shared Soviet heritage, active online communication, and preparedness for unification in response to Japan's frequent natural disasters. In fact, the largest online group within the Russian-speaking community in Japan came into existence following the 2011 Tohoku earthquake and tsunami. A large proportion of this migrant population, many of whom were born in the 1970s and 1980s, identifies Russian-speaking and ex-Soviet. This is the community from where I recruited my research participants, namely Russian-speaking post-Soviet migrants who arrived after 1990s. It should be noted that in the past several years, many smaller communities have emerged in Japan, representing other former Soviet countries and focusing on multiple dimensions, including communication, cultural transmission, and politics. Some of the smaller communities serve as part of the larger Russian-speaking community online by reposting their content there, whereas others act completely separately. This slide illustrates the historical progression of migration from the Russian Empire, the Soviet Union, and later Russia to Japan, with a focus on Russia. Today's presentation looks at the newcomers, number 3. Initially, many of these newcomers, particularly many male migrants, came to Japan to work in the used car industry. By contrast, many of the women worked as entertainers in bars. In addition, many other women migrated through match-made marriages to Japanese nationals. Thus, the migration of these newcomers was most often due to labor and marriage. Later, migration became more diversified as more students arrived in Japan and more individuals traveled to the country to marry Japanese nationals without the help of matchmaking agencies. IT professionals and other skilled workers also subsequently joined the movement, and the latest wave even includes lifestyle migrants. This slide shows an image of how the presence of the Russian language in Japan is organized in digital spaces. One of the most active yet personalized groups now is the one in the middle, called like-minded people, or единомышленники. Various content and activities are filtered through these online groups. In some groups' descriptions, it is stated that the aim of the group is to bring together people in Japan from the former USSR who share a common heritage and knowledge of Russian language. Many of those who choose to belong to these groups can be arguably identified as post-Soviets. It is also important to mention that Facebook and other social networking sites became popular later, after the community building principles of these migrants had been already enacted on the ground. The online group on the slide is explicitly called SSSR, which apparently stands for Crazy, Crazy, Crazy Party. This information is important in view of the discussion about cultural recycling in the later part of the presentation. As explained earlier, bringing people together for the purposes of socialization and preparedness against disasters has been an organizing principle of post-Soviet migrants living in Japan. This principle can effectively be put into practice through communication, общение, which is referred to here in the sense introduced by Yurchak. This layer of cultural understanding related to shared Soviet past was an immediately available tool that could bring people together. So-called Sovietness was enacted through the intimate practices of общение, which traversed the new borders. Effective material practices include shashlik, singing campfire songs accompanied by guitar music, dancing lizginka, gathering at a suburban house that the migrants named dacha temporarily, and remembering childhood songs, television programs, and Soviet movies. Some of these pastimes include and even reinforce various multicultural themes. The Dutch example is particularly notable because it brings us to the second major theme of this presentation, namely housing, which will be discussed in greater detail later. The described situation is of interest because it can be hypothesized that had these migrants not left Russia, Ukraine, Uzbekistan, or another country represented in this research, they may have strived to actively distance themselves from Soviet practices they considered outdated and instead engaged in more westernized or more culturally specific socialization practices. Yet, their migration to Japan, their demographics, and Japan's informational fatherness from the various post-Soviet processes in Eurasia led to such a situation. As mentioned, Japan's natural hazards and perhaps also its lack of integrational policies for migrants made unification through Soviet-style общение the most natural choice. We can see how effective material practices foster feelings of home and belonging and accelerate community building through Soviet-style общение. This image shows Russian-speaking men at a gathering dancing lizginka. At this point, we may not yet fully apply the concept of cultural recycling, but we can observe how fruitful ground for the future cultural recycling of Soviet concepts is being prepared. A notable twist, however, occurs when the migrants who are the subject of this research start finding Sovietness in the unfamiliar and thus turn it into the familiar. This slide shows the Russian-speaking migrants Russian-speaking migrants in Japan have been long keen to apply the concept of Sovietness to many societal realities that they have observed in Japan. In conceptualizing and making sense of the things they see in Japan, these migrants often use discursive strategies, as in phrases number 1, 2, and 3. Phrase 1 is a statement, phrase 2 is a resignation, and phrase 3 is the deeper recognition of something one was previously aware of, only superficially before they encountered it in reality, albeit in an unexpected context. The manner in which phrase 3 is structured can be explained by the fact that some of the migrants in my research were actually relatively young during the final years of the Soviet Union. Practices referred to as can't be held, it's the Soviet Union, ничего не поделаешь, Советский Союз, in relation to Japan are associated with Japan's bureaucracy, long committee meetings, and the no one left out principles in communities and compulsory education. As such, I suggest a definition of cultural recycling adopted for the purposes of this paper. Cultural recycling is when a certain concept is applied to something to which it was not originally meant to be applied, and thus fosters recognition and familiarity in the unfamiliar and expected in the unexpected. In this manner, in the context of migration, cultural recycling can serve as a way of coping and as an integrational strategy. In my current research, I analyze how this phenomenon happens in relation to housing, which is a natural extension of the theme of home mentioned earlier. I believe that this example can be referred to as cultural recycling in the sense of the definition provided earlier. Migration to an industrialized country entails a promise of comfort. However, comfort is not always achieved quickly, and in some cases, it never is. Because many migrants who formed the initial backbone of the Russian-speaking community in Japan were irregular workers, students, their experiences of housing in Japan were in accordance with their status, meaning they could only afford modest living conditions. Subsequently, even after climbing the socioeconomic ladder in Japan, many migrants realized that middle-class housing in Japan fell far short of their dreams. The reality of the situation is corroborated by discriminatory rental practices. No foreigners allowed is still a common, if unspoken, preference of many Japanese property owners. In fact, a recent survey conducted by Japan's Ministry of Justice revealed that almost 40% of such migrants have experienced some form of discrimination in relation to housing. After moving to Japan, many of the migrants in my sample soon realized that the places of residence they were able to rent were highly reminiscent of the Soviet Khrushchevkas. The slide shows images of some of the places of residence of the migrants in my sample, specifically those that some migrants were eager to compare to Khrushchevkas. However, notably, even migrants who lived in different types of buildings still frequently mentioned Khrushchevkas in their narratives as a key reference point. It seems they were recycling this concept to make sense of the housing available to them in Japan. Specifically, they were either living in a Khrushchevka-type building in Japan or did not want to live in one, going as far as to call such buildings barracks, barak. However, in both cases, the recycling of this concept emerged as central to meaning formation. Now, the word barracks is also heavily loaded with meaning for the people with the Soviet roots. Regarding the types of housing available in Japan, apartments are broadly classified based on whether they are situated in wooden two-story buildings, apato, or in reinforced concrete buildings, mansion. Kopo is a type of apato that is owned by a cooperative. Danchi is a complex of apartment buildings that closely resembles a collection of Khrushchevkas. The images in the slide shows danchi. The one on the left is newer and the one on the right is awaiting restoration. The migrants in my sample tended to eagerly name this danchi as well as other apartment buildings in Japan Khrushchevka. In fact, danchi were conceived of and first constructed during approximately the same period that Khrushchevkas were being built in the former USSR. At the time, Japan too faced questions regarding housing following World War II, as a new urban middle-class ideal was being established. In short, these processes occurred in parallel. For the migrants in my sample, however, encountering Khrushchevka-style buildings in Japan was unexpected and betrayed some of their dreams associated with migration. A reliance on cultural recycling helped these migrants to verbalize and alleviate some of their frustrations. Khrushchevka became a keyword for both recognition and distancing. Some migrants found these Japanese buildings to be as undesirable or even worse than Khrushchevkas. However, the presence of this familiar aspect of living served as a crucial reference point. The slide shows data related to the current dwellings of the migrants in my sample based on an online survey. As shown by this data, when the survey was conducted, not many of the migrants actually lived in the prefabricated buildings in Japan that can be considered as most closely resembling Khrushchevkas. Nevertheless, it should be considered that the majority of the respondents were long-term stayers. Therefore, in most cases, they had had experiences of living in one of those types of apartment, albeit during the earlier years of their stay in Japan. Even after having relocated to condominiums known as mansion or to detached houses, many continued to hold negative views of Japan's housing. Khrushchevka, as a reference point, were dreaded by some and remembered with nostalgia by others, depending on the type of housing they were eventually able to secure for themselves in Japan. Regarding the pre-migration accommodation of the surveyed population, only slightly under 12% had actually lived in Hrushevkas. However, judging from how often and how actively such buildings were referred to in the migrants' narratives when they were conceptualizing their housing in Japan, Hrushevka can be considered a discursive category and a conceptual tool enacted in the process of cultural recycling rather than actual confirmation of a lived experience. Mentioning Hrushevkas enabled them to serve as a reference point for the migrants to make sense of features of their housing in Japan, such as thin walls, low ceilings, and a lack of space. Many of these features are also present in a variety of housing in Japan that is available to migrants. In summary, by recycling the term Hrushevka, the research participants voiced their frustrations and anxieties related to the experience of being a migrant. The next, final example comes from migrant socialization and placemaking practices. Owning or renting a suburban house in Japan, in addition to an urban apartment, is not as widespread a practice as it is in Russia and many other post-Soviet countries. Some people in Japan of the upper middle class or upward do own two properties in this manner, and this practice has grown in popularity since the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic. However, generally speaking, it is a highly expensive endeavor. Among my interviewees, such dual property ownership had been achieved by a rare few. However, nostalgia for dacha, even among those who had not owned such a dwelling before migration, was present in many of the recorded narratives. The case to be introduced illustrates how a group of Russian-speaking migrants organized a dacha weekend for themselves in the absence of an actual dacha. The Japanese husband of one of my research participants was a real estate agent who was preparing to sell a rural house. His Russian wife offered to clean the house before the sale. She then gathered almost 10 people together by inviting them for a dacha weekend. She ensured that one of the invitees was from the Caucasus and knew how to cook shashlik kebab. He joined wearing a karakul papacha. The invitees took the invitation seriously. One even arrived in a Japanese car with a do-it-yourself Moskvich label. They ate, drank, talked, sang, and danced in the house's garden and then stayed overnight. In the morning, they were told that they would need to clean the house, which they did. The narrative was we were at a dacha. Dacha was the most frequently used word that weekend. This case is unique as it shows that even in the absence of a genuine dacha, a house was temporarily employed to serve the dacha function in the process of cultural recycling, which unfolded along discursive and material lines. In my research paper, I focus on the material practices of post-Soviet Russian-speaking migrants living in Japan. Many elements of the practices of socialization and belonging among these migrants derive from Soviet-style friendly communication общения. I hypothesized that these practices may have taken a reinforced form precisely because of the participants' migration to a country considerably isolated geographically and informationally from the post-Soviet world of Eurasia and in need of unification in the face of its volatile seismic and meteorological situation. In addition, I demonstrate that for these migrants, notions associated with Sovietness at large is a useful discursive tool to make sense of multiple phenomena that they observe in Japan. While the migrants were not necessarily supportive of this phenomena, labeling them as resembling features also found during the Soviet period made it easier for the migrants to make sense of this phenomena and come to terms with them. In particular, I focused on the housing available to these migrants, materially expressed yet structurally predetermined, in the sense of the type of housing actually accessible to the migrants. When such migrants recycle the word Hrushevka to describe a building in Japan, the word serves as a conceptual tool that is effective in illustrating the failed hopes of migration, anxiety over one's status as a migrant, and inequality in wider society. At the same time, this conceptual tool serves as a means of finding the familiar in the unfamiliar and translating one's experiences into a language of recognition and commonality, a practice that may reinforce feelings of belonging and community. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. It's very, very strict time, 20 minutes. Perfect. Okay, we come back to Europe, I hope. And now, Veronika Peche, it's okay with pronunciation.
Yeah, that's right.
The Institute for Contemporary History of the Czech Academy of Science. Velvet Retro, Popular Culture and the Czech Memory of the Pre-1989 Past. Veronika, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you. You can see the presentation, yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, excellent. Well, thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you also for the invitation to speak at this conference. I'm going to talk about something somewhat different to what we heard in the previous two presentations, but hopefully we will also be able to find some interesting dialogues between our topics. I'll be talking about popular culture, mainly popular commercial cinema in the Czech Republic, produced after 1989, and how it reflects upon the pre-1989 past. So focusing on the Czech Republic, as I mentioned, as a case study, the starting premise of my paper is that the power of certain products of popular culture to shape the shared images of the communist past has been massive, to say the least. Films such as Cozy Dens, directed by Jan Hřebejk, or Kolia, directed by Jan Svěrák, have been seen by more than 1 million viewers in cinemas alone in a country of 10 million. So you can imagine that these films are really very well known and have been also constantly repeated on television. Phrases from the films have become household items. And so such representations, I believe, deserve to be treated seriously as memory-making media. And for younger generations, they have often served as the first point of access to the socialist past. Much of the scholarship on cultural reflections of the past in the former Eastern Bloc has been framed in terms of post-socialist nostalgia, which has been mentioned at this conference already, and in particular the German debates on nostalgie. But in the Czech case, I would like to argue there is little evidence for nostalgia for either the utopian impulse of the socialist project or its everyday aspects. Nostalgia is a term that implies some kind of emotional connection to the past. But what I observe in the Czech case is that popular culture reappropriates especially the aesthetic aspects of life under state socialism, while not at all longing for the return of the system, but on the contrary, being quite open about condemning the communist regime. So in this paper, I will examine this dynamic both on the examples of retrospective representations produced after 1989, especially films, and also on the cultural recycling of socialist popular culture in the post-1989 era. So insofar as nostalgia is present, it takes quite an unlikely object in the Czech case. And that is nostalgia for resistance against the regime and for bringing it down with small private gestures. But these are not big heroic acts of resistance. Czech films don't focus on dissidents or political prisoners. Instead, they usually take up stories of ordinary people who perform very minor gestures of disagreement with the communist regime. Perhaps one of the best examples comes from the film Cozy Dens, where one of the main characters walks out onto the balcony and shouts a rather innocent anti-regime obscenity, which you can read on my slide. I'm not going to read it for you. And then he goes back into his apartment and tells his wife, "Oh, I feel so much better now. I feel so relieved." So this is a kind of very typical dynamic in Czech films, where these ordinary characters perform these kind of very minor gestures of what I call petty heroism. And I wanted to show you a clip from another film called The Identity Card, which is based on a novel by writer Petr Šabach, which deals with a group of teenage friends in the 1970s who also are kind of slightly flirting with the counterculture. I mean, they wear long hair, which was kind of frowned upon by the authorities at the time, and are generally opposed to any kind of authority, as many young teenage men tend to be. And that's kind of what the film follows, but it's set in the historical context of the 1970s in Czechoslovakia. And I'm just going to show you a short clip where these four friends perform a kind of small act of resistance.
I'm afraid we cannot hear anything, but we got subtitles only. But
Sorry?
we cannot hear the voice from.
Oh, you can't hear the voice of the video?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry about that. Let me see if I can do something. I mean, the volume seems to be...
I'm sorry, Veronica, maybe
Yeah?
you forgot to mark just sharing the audio in the window of the sharing screen. It is in
Aha.
the left bottom corner.
Left bottom
Like
corner.
you should tick and
Aha.
make the mark. Maybe just stop your screen sharing and
Oh, share sound.
yeah,
Now I can
and do
see
it
it.
again.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm sorry about this. Let me just oh, okay. Sorry. I do apologize. Now Zoom is telling me I have to install something. So I'm sorry. This is the only video I have in the presentation, so I'm going to skip it. I'll just tell you what's going on here. Basically, these four friends, one of them is telling his friends, look, the 15th Party Congress is coming up. Let's all tear out page 15 from our identity card booklets. And the other friends are somewhat taken aback and they're saying, are you sure this is a good idea? And the first friend says, well, this is what my older brother did. And then all the other guys are like, oh, well, okay, if your older brother did it, then let's do it. But are you sure he tore out the whole page, or did he perhaps tear only a small part of the page? And then the first friend has to admit, well, maybe it was just a small tear, maybe it wasn't the whole page. So basically what we see in this clip is this kind of dynamic of playing down heroism, right? That first there's this idea of, oh, let's do this act of resistance, let's perform some kind of resistant gesture. And then it turns out maybe it's not actually that politically motivated, maybe it's really just kind of imitating older peers. And maybe it's not going to be tearing out the whole page, but rather just this kind of small tear that actually the authorities won't really notice. And a lot of the humor of these films, and they do tend to be comedies in the Czech context, really plays on this kind of deflation of acts of resistance. So what I suggest is that in the Czech context, a kind of aesthetic fascination with the past, and you can see that the films, have kind of very detailed period costumes. They try to reconstruct the kind of aesthetic veneer of the past very carefully. This aesthetic fascination is not at odds with, but in fact reinforces a kind of anti-communist dismissal of the politics of state socialism. Heroism in popular culture is aimed at ordinary people and everyday actions. And of course, this means these representations offer a kind of very flattering picture of Czech society and Czech national identity as being inherently democratic. Many of these films suggest that, ordinary people were by default all actually opposed to the communist regime and perform these minor acts of resistance on a daily basis. So this, this grants some kind of feeling of a kind of common sense of a democratic national identity, what these films are trying to construct. So because basically these films assume that viewers share a condemnation of the past regime with the protagonists. And because this assumption is always in place, they can set explicit politics aside and indulge in the pleasing and amusing aesthetics of the past, which are thus rendered non-threatening. And to capture this, I use the term retro to designate a memory regime devoid of affect or lived memory, a kind of pick and mix attitude capitalizing on the stylistic repertoires of the past, which lends it to various irreverent and ironic iterations, while all the time enjoying the colors and sounds and textures of the past. And I think it's precisely this unemotional approach that allows for appropriations that can exploit symbols associated even with the repressive aspects of the communist regime. So rather than a subset of nostalgia, I think the phenomenon I'm describing here deserves to be considered on its own terms. And the emotional dimension associated with nostalgia is not really helpful when discussing such detached appropriations of the past. So I think retro's usefulness really lies in its temporal dynamic. Unlike the sense of historical rupture and loss posited by nostalgia, retro presents an effort to integrate the past into a continuum with the present. the knowledge of the historical outcome grants retro representations a kind of position of superiority from which the audience is viewing the past, allowing audiences to appropriate and also ridicule aspects of the past. And I think here my conceptualization of retro intersects with some of the literature on cultural recycling. For example, Chardin argues that recycling and reprise undermine the authority of the object. And this is something we witness in the kind of neutralizing of the threat or the authority of communist ideology that we see in these retro appropriations. But retro is definitely not a dynamic characteristic only of the Czech context or indeed the post-socialist space. An aesthetic fascination with the past narrated from a position of affirming the more enlightened politics of the present can be found across Western representational culture as well. In this way, I called the presentation Velvet Retro because it acknowledges the fact that this memory regime offers just as much a commentary on the present as on the past it turns to. It is firmly rooted in the era inaugurated by the Czechoslovak Velvet Revolution of 1989. And velvet is perhaps fitting in another sense too, because much of the Czech cultural memory of the past sought not to antagonize, but rather to create a gentle image or to hark back to the Slovak name for the revolution of 1989, the gentle revolution of state socialism, so gentle velvet and so on. One of the main attractions of these films, which are generally quite popular, have good audience figures in the Czech Republic. One of their main attractions is the retro look, which reproduces also the fashions, hairstyles, makeup, and general material universe of the period it portrays. The relationship towards the material culture of the past, while fetishizing the quirky and the outdated, also contributes to this kind of generally superior, even condescending attitude towards the past. A good example is the, is the television series Tell Me a Story, which ran on public television in the Czech Republic between 2009 and 2013 in 5 seasons. And it's basically a soap opera that tells the story of a, so to say, typical Czechoslovak family from the 1960s to the present. The main hero, Karel, his father, and his staunchly anti-communist grandmother all prefer to stay out of politics. And they present a kind of model for living through the previous regime in a kind of comfortable but uncompromising manner. Another character in the series, on the other hand, becomes a dissident, and he's not portrayed so favorably. So the pedagogy of the series is focused on the notion of the ordinary person rather than the exception of dissent. And the main characters here are really shown as sharing a kind of innate democratic sentiment, which structures their principles. Even though the series really fetishizes socialist era material artifacts, and we can see, for example, the opening credits of the series all kind of use these animations of typical period artifacts, such as a television that you can see here, but also, let's say, typical bottles or a radio and so on. The political message is clear. That the characters express. Communists are not to be trusted, never were and never will be. And while the kind of idealist, activist, and later dissident character ends up in prison, the main hero, thanks to his obstinate ignorance of politics, even at the height of the so-called Prague Spring, is portrayed as the most efficient strategy for survival. And he waits patiently until the 4th season of the series, where the changes of 1989 retrospectively validate his view, and he finally sets up his own company in a newfound enterprising zeal. So the series selection and recycling of certain elements of socialist popular culture becomes a mechanism of incorporating the socialist period into this larger narrative of continuity, which enables the narrativization of everyday life under socialism, but suggesting all this at the same time that Czechs never endorsed communist ideology while existing within it. With their protagonists, which scorn communist politics, such representations help to perpetuate the myth of the Czechs as a democratic nation, and also actually the nostalgia they express is implicitly aimed at the interwar so-called First Republic which holds the place of a kind of myth of the kind of wellspring of Czech democracy in the Czech national imaginary. In the remainder of this paper, I would just like to consider how recycling of cultural artifacts from the socialist past displays a similar political agenda. Illustrative is a series of incidents that erupted around 1999 in the Czech public sphere. First, the public service broadcaster Czech Television decided to rescreen the 1970s crime series, The 30 Cases of Major Zeman, which you can see on the slide on the left, which was by many perceived as a very heavily ideologized product of socialist television. And those who rejected the series considered it wrong for a public broadcaster to show a program so blatantly defending an ideology they viewed as criminal. So pushing an anti-communist agenda and defending the interests of victims of communist era repression, those opposed to the rescreening worried that watching what they found to be communist propaganda would have adverse effects on young people and would generally manufacture an erroneous memory of the period. And a similar reaction could be detected around the singer Karel Gott, who you can see on the right, who's massively popular, and he was selected to represent the Czech Republic at the World Fair in Hanover in 2000. And again, we got the same kind of reaction that surely somebody so closely associated with the previous regime should not be representing the new democratic country abroad. But at the same time, many fans of both the series and Karel Gott were, for instance, writing letters to newspapers defending their favorite series and their favorite singer. And basically, they were arguing for integrating these products of popular culture into their biographies. And the way these defenses of the 30 cases of Major Zeman or Karel Gott were structured was by reconciling the kind of anti-communist condemnation of the past that was happening in the media on the one hand, with a number of rhetorical strategies, namely categories of tradition, quality, and professionalism. So as historian Kamil Chinato has shown, the memoirs of popular socialist era actors are an important source of anti-communist interpretations of recent history, and he argues that they even have a greater influence on evaluating the period than historiography or history teaching in schools. And having surveyed a number of actors' memoirs, he concludes that actors often narrate their role in the previous regime as a confrontation of the individual with totalitarian power. They are frequently shown to have been at the mercy of greater abstract forces, which made them take on compromising roles or prevented them from performing the roles they wanted to. But actors are also unwilling to cast themselves as victims. It is their own agency, as articulated in a discourse of professionalism, that for them erases the division between socialism and post-socialism. So this strategy is really extremely common in actors' retrospective memoirs. It was also used by one of the actresses who performed in the 30 cases of Major Zeman, who in various media appearances around this controversy in 1999, argued that she was simply performing her professional task of being an actor. And professionalism is also really a rhetorical constant around Karel Gott's persona, which is invoked even by his critics. Former President Václav Klaus, for instance, really a champion of the discourse of expertise, argued in quite a remarkable essay on the occasion of Gott's 70th birthday that, to quote, in totalitarian Czechoslovakia, he became the first representative of show business, and adds that although many limiting structures were in place, they could not thwart Karel Gott's professionalism. Am I running out of time now? Yeah, okay. I mean, I'm going to wrap up. So we can really see here that, you know, professionalism is used as this category that kind of bridges, allows certain products of socialist popular culture to allows for this recycling in the present era, even though there is such a pervasive kind of anti-communist critique going on in the Czech public sphere. And professionalism isn't the only category that works in this way. Quality and tradition do as well. You know, while critics of socialist era pop culture cite that these are ideological products, the riposte to such criticism has been to label socialist popular culture as examples of quality and tradition. And this is the way that, for instance, brands such as the shoe brand Botas, which is kind of a popular brand of shoes that started to be produced in the 1950s in Czechoslovakia, has marketed itself. So, as a traditional Czech product, as a kind of quality Czech product. And these labels allow the brand to extricate its image from its association with the communist past, which could for some audiences be perceived as negative, and to kind of integrate their story into a wider narrative of Czech manufacturing history. So tradition, quality, and professionalism are strategies for accommodating the socialist past into a larger Czech cultural continuity that bridges the break of 1989, while not necessarily being at odds with the dominant anti-communist discourse. Tradition and professionalism are contemporary values that are, however, dressed as non-ideological categories, retrospectively projected onto the past. They are employed to discursively extract socialist popular culture into a seemingly politically neutral sphere, which thus allows for positively valued recycling of socialist entertainment or material products, while still easily condemning the so-called system of the past as a whole. So I think I will stop here, and hopefully I managed to kind of show how my conceptualization of retro culture can also kind of be understood as a form of cultural recycling. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Probably there will be the questions, and you can get the opportunity to say something else during the discussion.
Yes, let me just stop sharing the screen.
Okay.
Sorry.
It's work. Okay. The last but not the least, Maria Engström, Uppsala University, and another interesting topic, queering the mainstream, Alexander Gutkov and cultural recycling of the Soviet 80s. Maria, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Valery, and all the organizers for the opportunity to talk to you and this wonderful conference. So as Alexei already mentioned, even this paper is a part of our new research project funded by the Swedish Research Council, and we are just in the beginning of the project, which is called Nostalgia of Modernity, Neo-Soviet Myths in Contemporary Russian Culture. And my focus today will be on the connection between cultural recycling and contemporary queer turn, which I argue is an important connection. So in contemporary Russia, queer and gay culture is still de facto outlawed, gay activism is persecuted, and the official discourse openly forbids gay propaganda. However, a series of recent media events indicate that the new decade will see the normalization of Russian queer culture and the privatization of transgressive aesthetics by the cultural mainstream. For example, in November 2019, Ksenia Sobchak invited open gay Russian celebrities to a discussion about political issues, cultural issues, and this roundtable was titled "Шесть геев и Собчак," 6 gays and Sobchak, on YouTube, of course. The April 2020 Russian issue of Tatler magazine featured a transgender star, Natasha Maximova, on its cover. In late June 2020, Karen Sheinyan, who is an open gay journalist, showed his documentary Священный русский queer, Sacred Russian Queer, also on YouTube. In official media, queer culture can also be visible, but only, well, at least today, only through irony and parody. That is why it is often smuggled into mainstream media, including state-controlled media, state-controlled TV channels, for example, through camp aesthetics and various satirical genres. So the first gay revolution in post-Soviet Russia took place in the 90s. In 1989, artist and cultural theorist Timur Norikov established the first artistic queer community, the New Academy of Fine Arts in St. Petersburg. This golden and already mythical age of the Russian queer culture included ideologically and aesthetically quite different cultural phenomena. For example, the gay art of Georgy Guryanov, who was the drummer in the cult rock band Kino, the first rave parties in St. Petersburg, which were also the first drag shows, camp performance by Vladislav Mamyshev Monroe, and Mark talked about him yesterday. The diverse activities of Yaroslav Slava Magutin, the first Russian open gay journalist, writer, photographer, but also a member of the National Bolshevik Party. The avant-garde queer lifestyle magazine Om and Ptuch, and many, many other interesting phenomena. So gay visibility and gay visuality were dominant features of the pop culture of the 90s, which was the era of sexual revolution. And it's precisely this aesthetic and ideological vision of the gay 90s, веселые 90s, at the time of total freedom, which has been most successful and competing with the official, current official version of the 90s as the time of troubles, лихие 90s. Today we are also witnessing, I believe, the transformation of the queer culture of the late 80s and early 90s into investable assets and capital, not only cultural capital, but the real capital. Mark Fisher, a British music critic, philosopher and cultural theorist, when discussing in his famous book, Capitalist Realism, is there no alternative? I'm sorry, the phenomenon of alternative culture, culture's absorption by post-industrial capital and the incorporation of non-conformists into the manageable mainstream argues that neoliberal capitalism is obliterating utopian imagination and consequently the image of the future. It is not creating new culture, but living off the old one, turning any authentic cultural phenomena into a museum of ghosts and dead exhibits. I quote, in the conversion of practices and rituals into merely aesthetic objects, the beliefs of previous cultures are objectively ironized, transformed into artifacts. The production of current queer discourse in Russia is closely associated with the name of Alexander Gudkov, born 1983, one of the main creative ideologies behind contemporary Russian pop culture. His name appears as a scriptwriter or creative producer in the closing credits of a number of recent mega hits, such as Philip Kirkorov's «Цвет настроения синий», Cream Soda's «Никаких больше вечеринок», «No More Parties», or Cream Soda's «Плачу на техно», mega hit with more than 50 million views on YouTube, and a controversial composition by Svetlana Loboda, Boom Boom, and many, many others. Gudkov can be considered as a leading trickster of modern Russian showbiz, who constantly provokes the norms through a synthesis of parody, irony, or rather post-irony, camp, media archaeology, and purification of the Soviet visual legacy. He often exploits the nostalgic discourse through queer recycling of Soviet and early post-Soviet television programs and music videos. For example, the 2018 New Year's Eve РБК style праздничный эфир на сиреневой луне resembles a generic Soviet estrada program of the early 80s. Many of his videos can be used to illustrate Mark Fisher's thesis about ontological nature of contemporary culture. For example, the 2019 video titled Tectonic featured some fading actors looking for gigs. They were played by Gudkov and another popular star, Ekaterina Varnava. They danced the nostalgic tectonic dance of the late 90s in a posh, by invitation only club where they fall victim to rich old vampires. Gudkov's video про белые розы, shot for Dima Bilan in 2019, periodically refers to the mega hits of the late 80s, such as Белые розы by the boy band Ласковый май and Yellow Tulips by Natasha Koroleva, and some others easily recognized by the post-Soviet audience. The song in the video is also clearly built on Fisher's concept of ontology and reflects the collapse of futurity, reflects the retrospectivity of our times. They are built as a fragments of ruins of the past, being resampled, recorded, and assigned with new meanings. The principal female character, a provincial bureaucrat who likes to say to the future without the 90s, which reflects the official point of view, and as well as the initiator of the demolition of the Metalurg Community Center where she used to dance at discos, starts hearing the music of her youth and seeing her favorite singer everywhere. A sorcerer, played by Gudkov, and a priest fail to drive the ghost out. Relief comes only after she kisses the past. Gudkov gives new life not only to the old cultural material, but also to real Soviet bodies. His show Damsky Klub is a part of a popular Russian TV show Вечерний Ургант. In this show, senior women, whom he addresses as девчонки, girls, discuss contemporary political issues in a typical Soviet babushka rhetoric style. The avant-garde Russian contemporary artists and musicians who collaborate with Gudkov, for example, Little Big, the band Little Big, frequently use old Soviet bodies as the same way they use the ruins of the Soviet landscape, like old sanatorium, houses of culture, and so on. So like ready-mades. The recycling by purification of Soviet visual canon, cult films, TV shows, cartoons, or socialist realist pictures offered by Gudkov and other contemporary artists is by all means not new. The first queer remakes of Soviet visual canon were made back in the late 80s and 90s by Timur Novikov, Georgy Guryanov, Mamashov Monroe, and we remember it from Mark's presentation from yesterday, and many other neo-academic artists. The recomposition, перекомпозиция, as Timur Novikov called it, of the Soviet culture occurs within neo-academies through queer lens. We see two main strategies in the homoerotic rendering of the Soviet. The first one, which I call heroic or new romantic, is offered by Georgy Guryanov. You see here, for example, his famous remake of Alexander Rom's Stern Young Man, Строгий юноша. Oh, sorry. What happened? I'm sorry. Back to the presentation. Just a minute. Can you see it? Can you see it? Yeah,
Yes,
okay,
we can.
good.
Yes.
So because I see just black screen for a moment. Okay, so these two strategies, the first one is offered by Georgy Guryanov, and the second one offered by Mamyshev Monroe, which we can call camp or drug. Monroe was not the only one developing this line. Olga Tobliluts, for example, we can mention here as well, or Oleg pseudo fake gay couple, Oleg Maslov and Viktor Kuznetsov, and some other artists. So the current wave of queer recycling is developing these two strategies. For example, famous Russian fashion designer Gosha Rubchinsky, I think, is following this neo-romantic line, and he's open about it. He made the remakes of Timur Novikov's pictures and designs, while Renata Litvinova as well. While Gudkov and his team is developing the camp visuality of Mamyshev Monroe. A photo exhibition called Ruskiye Vопросы, the Russian questions, curated by Ekaterina Andreeva in Russian Museum 97, is worth noting in this context. The exhibition presented queer remakes by Mamyshev Monroe of Soviet fairy tales for children, such as Kamenny Tsvetok, The Stone Flower, Morozka, Frosty, and others. And Gudkov continues this neo-academic tradition of camp and media archaeology and works with Soviet ready-mades. For example, in December 2018, he wished everyone on Instagram Happy New Year 1959 in the guise of the protagonist from the movie Morozka. The recycling of the late Soviet aesthetics is especially interesting in the recent project by Ivan Urgant, Alexander Gudkov, and Mitya Hrustalov, the New Year's Eve show Ciao 2020 on Channel 1, as a special episode of the Вечерний Urgant program. The ironic recycling of the past incorporates here the theme of the imaginary West of the 80s, when Soviet TV would occasionally include Western singers in the program Melodии и ритмы зарубежной эстрады, Melodies and Rhythm of Foreign Pop Music. It would also broadcast music festivals and shows, including Eurovision and the Sanremo Festival. Due to various political and cultural reasons, Italian artists almost monopolized Soviet television, especially popular were Toto Cutugno, Adriano Celentano, the groups Ricky Poveri, Mattia Bazar, and some others. So the show Ciao 2020 offers a camp version of the 80s nostalgia. The host, Ivan Urgant, Gudkov, and other actors were dressed in the colorful 80s fashion, speaking grammatically correct, but still grotesque, exaggerated Italian. Maybe we can talk about over-identification here. The current hits of Russian pop music were translated from Russian to, as you can see here, the names of the Russian artists in Italian. So the current hits were translated from Russian to Italian and performed in Italian by the Russian artists themselves. And the only exception was Little Big. They were called Piccolo Grandi. They didn't perform their own music, but made a cover of the cult song Mamma Maria by Ricky Poveri. So the show also managed to introduce some trace of contemporary queer visuality. For example, at some point, the host and his guests were watching gay porno movie on a handheld camera, and the dance routine by the group Cream Soda included a half-naked gladiator and Alexander Gudkov as a flamboyant Juventus player. So cultural recycling is used here for introducing the contemporary, transgressive and non-hegemonic masculinity to the Channel 1 audience. The recycling of late socialist aesthetics is intertwined in this show with the subversive and ironic appropriation of Western culture. So the show can be interpreted not only as a satire of the vampiric nature of contemporary mainstream popular music shows or popular culture, unable to create anything new, but as a still parody of the late Soviet imaginary West and a visualization of current decolonial sensibility. In post-Soviet Russia, especially in the latest decade, queer and camp aesthetics are often used not only as an instrument of criticism of the current cultural political mainstream or political regime, but also for articulation of a new Russian national identity. The transnational success of the Gopnik style, or so-called New East style, marked the end of the post-socialist imitation of the West and is directly linked to the rise of identity politics in Eastern Europe and Russia. Subversive affirmation of current Russia's outlaw status is reflected in a triumph of a radicalized version of the Gopnik style, which I suggest calling Russian neo-camp. Camp, the trash glamour, and queer aesthetics as a safe zone of a minority bereft of basic human and political rights are transferred into the sphere of international relations and become the meaningful elements of the language of decolonization and resistance against the global political and cultural hegemony of the West. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Okay, we've got 4 very interesting, very different papers. So, I wait for
sorry.
people who want to ask the questions and discuss with our panelists. There's no questions. Oh, I've got Zinaida.
Yeah, maybe I can start then. Yeah, thank you very much. There were a lot of interesting thoughts and ideas in all 4 presentations. So I just, to kick off the discussion, I would like to ask a question to Veronica and ask about the film, because if I understood you correctly, so in a way you contrasted the films like Kola, for example, to the others, by pointing to the fact that Kola is kind of more nostalgic compared to the others that point more to this retro culture. And it kind of surprised me, because when I watched Kola, it was an interesting experience, because I thought, wow, it's an interesting work, kind of with the memory going on in Czech Republic, because I read it as an attempt to reflect on the post-socialist legacy, and to carefully kind of separate the culture, the Russian culture, and that part of the legacy that the Czechs are kind of ready to keep and to live with, embodied in the character of this innocent boy who is kind of not responsible for the system and for the negative sides of that experience, and as opposed to his mother, who is at the same time kind of the product of the system, and especially of the late period of socialism, because she's rather kind of a classic corrupted prostitute style, Russian woman, very stereotypical Russian woman who is busy with organizing her private life in the US or somewhere, and who is leaving her boy from the previous marriage in Czech Republic because she just doesn't have time to deal with it. And kind of the Czech family, well, not family, but the characters of the film, in a way kind of demonstrate this togetherness of the Czechs and the humanity of the Czechs that are still kind of ready to maintain this, or to incorporate and recycle this legacy in human terms, but not in political terms. So I wonder why you kind of classified this film as nostalgic and not as again this retro category, because in my view it's also about the post-socialist Czech dynamic and about this digesting of the legacy, especially considering how many Russian immigrants remained in Czech Republic and then immigrated via Czech Republic in the post 1989. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for this question. I mean, that's also a very interesting reading of the film Kolya that you offer. I mean, I think Kolya is quite kind of unique within this corpus of Czech films dealing with the socialist past, because in the first place, unlike some of these later films I discussed, it really kind of works with sentimentality. In a very kind of directed manner, right? It tries to wrench emotions from its audience because of this kind of lovely, innocent little boy and a kind of this generally kind of heartwarming story. And, you know, these other kind of retro films are really very kind of detached in their emotionality. Like, and this is kind of perhaps a distinction to be made, that, you know, these kind of detached retro appropriations of the past work when they deal with kind of everydayness. But the moment you get some kind of big historical event, then this kind of more sentimental, emotional repertoire comes in place. And Kolya, of course, kind of the whole story moves towards the Velvet Revolution, towards this kind of climactic, culminating moment where kind of, you know, the Czechs overcome this difficult time they were living in, right? And kind of, it's a kind of very celebratory ending. And it's quite interesting that, you know, in some of these later films that are kind of very focused on these ordinary everyday characters, the moment you get something like the portrayal of the 1968 invasion of Czechoslovakia by the Warsaw Pact forces, then suddenly also these stylistic repertoires change. And you get the colors become more subdued. For instance, you get kind of more sentimental music. You know, there's more kind of a play with emotions. And so Kolya was also quite unique, you know, given the also very specific position of the director Jan Svěrák kind of within the Czech film industry. He did also go on to win an Academy Award for this film, which kind of no other post-socialist Czech film has managed. But I think you are very right to interpret this in the sense that Kolya really plays again on the sense of kind of offering this very flattering picture to Czechs of their humanity, right? So actually critics kind of hated Kolya when it first came out because they leveled accusations of kitsch at it, you know, and they were using kitsch in the sense defined by Milan Kundera as kind of, you know, this when you see, he has this famous moment in one of his novels that kitsch is not when you see children running on the grass and you cry, but only when you realize that you are crying at seeing children running on the grass, and that second tear is only that moment of kitsch, and that's kind of what many critics were saying, is that Kolya is trying to evoke, and actually this kind of presumably kind of all-encompassing humanity of the film was not actually necessarily read as a kind of Vergangenheitsbewältigung, or, you know, coming to terms with the past. So it's interesting, you know, the film kind of probably had a much better reception abroad than it did in the Czech Republic.
Thank you. Natalia.
Yes, thank you very much. Well, first and foremost, I would like to express my greatest appreciation to all of the panelists. Your presentations have provided a plethora of wonderful and valuable field data and insights, which I'm still struggling to digest, so to speak. But in order to limit myself to one person and one question, I would like to address it to Ksenia, if I may. And I was fascinated by the very starting point statement of your presentation about the Russian community, Russian-speaking community in Japan, preparedness for unification. That intrigued me right away, because personally and professionally, I've been involved with very similar dynamics with the Russian diaspora in the US. as a Russian Cultural Outreach Coordinator, as a director of a Russian Center. And what I've been observing for years and years was just the opposite. And I would like to ask Ksenia if she has any observations or speculations about how come that with very similar demographics, ethnic diversity, so forth, and very similar cultural settings, I would say the US, America is an island as well. It also carries this exceptionist and cultural isolationist mentality. How come that the outcomes are so different? Because while in Japan we have this preparedness for unification, in the US it is still this bellum omnius contra omnes, the war of all against all and so forth. And it doesn't seem to be stopping anytime soon. I would greatly appreciate you sharing some of your insights or speculations on that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Natalia, for this wonderful question. And I don't think I would have, of course, a definitive answer here. It's rather difficult to compare it to contexts, but I believe that because of Japan's, well, first of all, remoteness, because if we're talking about the Russian-speaking migrants who are coming from the Russia's far east, then they are located rather close geographically. But for everyone else, it's a 10, 12 hours flight back home. So there exists a remoteness that places the migrants as a rather isolated community. It grows on a rather slow path. I don't know the situation in the US, but in Japan, we have an influx of maybe 200, maybe 300 people a year. So it's not a very rapid rate. That would be one of the explanations. And I think people comparing to many different situations, natural hazards that people experience in Russia and other Soviet countries, or in US, for instance, like hurricanes or floods, I think probably two factors: fear of the unknown in the form of an earthquake, which is really actively present in Japan, is something that drives people to be prepared, not necessarily to actively communicate all the time, but to be prepared to unify. And the group which I was talking about today, it was actually initially called Stop Panic. Right after the 2011 earthquake, and people were checking whether everybody was all right. And I had an experience of actually interviewing someone from Ukraine about half a year after that occurrence, and it was a massive fear. We can maybe use here a concept of a second-hand fear because of the situation with the Fukushima plant, and of course the memories of the Chernobyl. So all this partially fear of the unknown, of the natural hazards, and partially fear of actually known come together in a way that people become prepared. And communities who actually do meet very often, they do not encompass everyone. Of course, it would be false to say that everybody is ready to gather for the shashlik parties. But I believe that these parties, they provide very important islands here and there, that in a situation when people would have to come together, they would act as satellites to connect everyone else. So this is the situation I observe. Hopefully I have answered some of the parts of your question. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. But I believe there could be a very productive comparison between the two cases, and hopefully it may grow to bigger conclusions about this Sovietness as the common denominator to so many phenomena in Russian diaspora. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
I don't see another question, so maybe I ask the question. Ksenia, I know it's not a very scientific one, but I'm very curious how this flats in Japan looks like inside, because you show us the blocks, but I'm very curious. It's small. How many meters, for example, got this kind of flat?
Okay, I will have to translate because in Japan they count as tatami. Tatami is a floor mat. So a room which has like 6 tatami mats, and I'll have to translate it into meters. But the apartments are generally rather small. So a family could be living in an apartment which is like 40 meters, square meters. And this is rather good for an urban apartment in Japan. And thin walls, rather low ceilings, and also it is not really separated by doors in a conventional sense. It's more like sliding doors, so not so much privacy. So from that perspective, yes, it is reminiscent of how Hrushchevkas were, because it didn't really provide much privacy with walk-through rooms and conditions like that.
Thank you very much. Valery, you want to ask?
I have 2 little questions about the fate, about Fatum, destiny. And I have this question to Veronica and Maria. This is not question, this is request, I think. Please comment a little bit more about the following topics. Veronica, you mentioned 50 cases of Major Zeman. Please, can you comment a little bit more about post-socialist fate of this narrative? And another question is to Maria. Maria, please, what do you think about tattoo? They won't catch us. Is it queering or not? What is your fate? What is their fate in our contemporary situation? Thank you very much.
Okay.
Yeah, okay, if I may start. Thank you very much for this question. Yes, so the series I mentioned, the 30 Cases of Major Zeman, was a very, very popular television series that aired in the late 1970s. And it's a detective series, and it follows this detective Major Zeman, who deals with a whole number of cases which also touch upon aspects of Czechoslovak history that, and this is kind of where this TV series was later interpreted as very heavily ideologized, because it interprets these episodes of Czechoslovak history from a very communist ideological perspective, and in ways that then later works of historians, for instance, after 1989, showed to have unfolded somewhat differently. And this series was not shown on any television in the Czech Republic until 1999. It was rescreened on a private channel in Slovakia in 1998. And that caused some controversy, but it's also quite interesting that because this was a private television channel, generally the reception of that rescreening in Slovakia was, well, okay, we may not like this series, but it's a private channel, it's their business, they can do whatever they want to do. But when the public broadcaster wanted to rebroadcast the series in the Czech Republic in 1999, that's when a real controversy erupted, because public television was seen as having some kind of educating mission, and all these critics were saying, well, this is a kind of highly ideological product from the past, and why should we be showing this to people now? But I think, in my research, I kind of did quite a detailed typology of the different responses to this controversy. And there was a group who were very much against this rescreening, but my sense is that they were quite a small but very influential group of journalists, commentators in the media. They were also representing the interests of groups such as the Confederation of Political Prisoners, so people who had actually experienced some kind of persecution from the communist authorities before 1989. So these were also very much against it. But then there was a whole kind of different spectrum of responses, and there were people who were just kind of saying, well, this is part of our lives, please don't deny us our life experience. And then there were young people who were also actually viewing the series in a kind of camp way, right? That they were saying, well, this is so bad, it's actually good. The kind of ideological messages in the series are so blatant that it's actually funny to watch them today and to be like, oh my goodness, this is just so ridiculous. So there was, so these like fan clubs of the series started popping up, which were created by people who at the time were, 30 or something. So there were all these different responses, and it's quite interesting how Czech television responded, because after much kind of debate in the media, they did decide to rescreen the series, but with a series of accompanying debates with historians. So basically, they would screen the episodes, but then it would be followed by a discussion with some experts who would say, well, actually, it wasn't quite like that. But of course, if you look at the audience figures, the series had huge ratings, lots of people watched it, the debates, not so much.
It was the same, because yesterday, yes, we talked about Hans Kloss, and it was the same in Polish television. The new screening of this TV series was, but before every episode, there was a historian who talked what is wrong with this TV series.
Major Zeman was very popular in the USSR also, and it was one of my favorites series, TV series. Yeah. But I did not know that this is about communist ideology. I didn't know about it because I didn't know what does it mean, ideology.
And needless to say, after this initial controversy in 1999, it has been rescreened many times on different private and also on public television. And nowadays it's not considered a problem at all.
Very interesting subject for me, topic.
A couple of years ago, Major Zeman was released in Polish television 2 or 3 years ago.
I'd like to know about this situation more. It seems to me that Hans Kloss was not so popular in Russia. No. Luba, what do you think? Did you see it? I saw, but I don't know that it was. I'm not sure that it was so popular as Zeman.
But
you read in other books. You read other books.
Anyway, he was known.
Okay.
Maria, because
thank you. Thank you for the question. Yes, of course, tattoo is very important phenomenon here, and it was a part of this fake queer, fake gay sentiment, which was used for marketing. And it was quite, I think, logical in the spirit of the 90s to do it, because gay visuality was dominant. Kind of new culture was gay culture. So I think the 90s are still not studied properly, and we don't understand the revolutionary spirit of it. And when we say that 90s was it was bad culture, was nothing interesting and so on, it was only American influences. Of course it was, but still quite early in the 90s, the new type of culture was produced. And tattoo was a part of this queer revolution, as I see it. And it's very interesting because today it is recycled, and we know it is patriotic recycle, or it's a part of what I called conservative queer. Because we always think about gay or queer as a force of resistance to the regime. But in Russian case, it's not so simple. In Russian case, queer and gay community is a very large part of it, is a part of the regime. So tattoo is a great example of it, because we know they performed Nas ne dogoniat, they are not going to get us at the opening of the Sochi Olympics. And one of the singers are now hoping to become a politician as a part of Единая Россия. So it is a kind of great example of this, how the queer becomes a part of the regime in contemporary Russia. And it's not the only example. So, yeah.
Thank you very much. By the way, this concerns Maria's paper and yesterday's paper about Mamashев Monroe. You can see behind me a picture. This is, of course, not a Mamashев Monroe picture. This is one of our colleagues, to say, painted this picture several years ago. And this is not Lenin, as it was yesterday. I demonstrated Lenin, which we have in our room in Pushkinsky Dome. This is, who is it? Who recycled? Who is recycled? Can you guess?
I don't see.
Nobody can. You can make my picture wider if you tick a special box, but nobody can. This is
wait a minute. Just view.
This is official portrait.
Pick a view.
From
it's Zhirinovsky.
Nine.
Oh,
sorry, no.
Looks like him.
This is Gorbachev recycled.
Oh, okay. I think it's a fusion of Gorbachev and Zhirinovsky. The long 90s. Okay.
Sorry for my interruption.
No, but yesterday a new exhibition on Mamashев Monroe has opened in Moscow and Taganka. So, yeah, and of course he's very important. And I think we will see the recycling of the recycling. That's what I call the secondary recycling or вторичное, да.
A colleague of mine named it re-recycling.
Re-recycling, of course. And, yeah, and I think that the new generation is not really going back to the Soviet material, but they're going back to the first wave of recycling during the 90s. So that's the procedure, I think.
Thank you very much.
Okay, Anna, want to ask some question?
Yes, actually this will be kind of continuation of what you just said, because I have a question for Maria. I'm very excited about the whole project you are preparing. I'm looking forward to know more, to read more later. And my question is about this being part of official discourse, official media discourse. How would you place what Gudkov and Вечерний Urgan team are doing? Because actually you can see that some audience have this strong opinion, like, wow, you can see something like this on Channel 1, so the censorship still is not so harsh as someone wished to show. This is kind of this evident that you still can show something like this on TV. And the other voices say they accuse them of being part of this official discourse, that they are kind of compromises with, they agree to be part of Channel 1 to show their identity, they to do what they want. Yeah, so how would you place those kind of Ciao Venti Venti, Le Sirenieve Lunie, and those kind of show? Also maybe the other show, which was Голубой Ургант, I guess, yeah, when they were trying to rethink the heritage of the 90s. So maybe you can comment on this somehow. Is it critical or not at all?
I think the useful theory here is Mark Fisher's theory. I think he was the best. His analysis is the best. It's how neoliberal consumes neoliberal cultures. And Russian case, of course, we have this fusion of conservatism and neoliberalism, which is not strange at all in today's world. So and he analyzes the mechanism how neoliberal capital consumes all the alternative. So that's exactly what we see here. There is the question of pro-contra. The question of ideology is not important here. It's a question of consumption and how the mechanism, how neoliberalism переваривает, absorbs and then speeds, maybe when it's not giving money anymore, all the alternatives. And queer culture was an alternative. Even if it was a revolutionary culture of the 90s, it was still a counterculture. So it was still something new, something live. But what we see today is the ghost. That's why I think ontology is the second concept which I use in my analysis, because even Gutkov, and they are talented people, of course, but they are within the neoliberal system, and that's how everything works. So if Gutkov wants to make his own more controversial or more underground kind of projects, he will do it, but not on the challenge. And he does it on YouTube, of course, but not on Channel 1. So, yeah. Thank you.
Zinaida.
Yeah, maybe just one small comment in the same direction. I think that in the political analysis, kind of drawing on the same in the same direction and kind of criticizing neoliberalism says also that kind of a part so that the neoliberal capitalism not only commodifies everything and in this sense is kind of omnivorous and yeah, takes everything and digests everything, but also that the maintenance of contradictory meanings that are simultaneously present in the mediascape is precisely the source of power, because you maintain the uncertainty and confusions, and different groups of audiences can pick on different meanings, and there is no chance to build any solidarities, because all boundaries are at the same time contested and at the same time maintained, and
Exactly.
and this is the source of power. And maybe one small comment again to the conversation between Ksenia and I think it was Natalia's question. I think also to think about this kind of diasporas and how different kind of Sovietness is constructed and contested in different countries. We need also to closely analyze the culture of the receiving society. And of course, I mean, comparing the cases of the US and Japan, we have two very different contexts, because in the US, you have the culture emphasizing the individuality, autonomy, and not togetherness in any sense, while in Japan, of course, you kind of as a migrant, you face a very consolidated society, and basically you receive in a similar way. So it's a very general remark, but still. Thank you.
Can I comment? Okay. Or?
Sure, Maria, go ahead, and I'll do
Okay. Maria,
before I forget. No, yeah, thank you, Zinaida, for your comment. I didn't have time, but actually I use the concept of metamodernism for describing this new type of relations, the new type of culture, because if Mamyshev Monroe, it was a postmodern project, Gutkov is not postmodernism, it's metamodernism. And metamodernism is what we have now in this neoliberal capitalism. And it's exactly how you describe. It's kind of the sensibility where everything is present, and you can choose, depending on your personal interests, the type of critique or aesthetics or whatever you want. And it's the Dutch theorist described the metamodernism as a balance between the critique and the utopia. So those who want to see the critical level in Gutkov, or emancipatory level, they can see it. And those who can see the kind of pro-regime projects, they can see it. So and I think we never discussed it, and maybe we don't have time to do it, but recycling and metamodernism, that's what I would like you to think about, maybe discuss if you have time. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Ksenia.
Yeah, and if I may, I'll comment a little bit. Thank you very much for your comments, Zinaida. Definitely that. Although it is possible to talk a little bit about togetherness for the Japanese society also as a cultural myth in a way. I interviewed some people from US and Canada who would say that they feel more free in Japan rather than back home. So it is a bit of a stereotype also about the Japanese society that is fully consolidated and that it presents a certain degree of togetherness. But of course, comparing to such contexts as US, that would be so. What I haven't said earlier, but what is actually really important is that I suppose that for the post-Soviet migrants in US or other contexts, it is possible to actually to become a very active part of the receiving society, to be diluted into the society, to become American in a way. But for in case of Japan, that would be not completely impossible, but very difficult because there would always continue to exist a dichotomy of Japanese as a foreigner. This is a very, very strong construct that is still really present. So in my presentation, I said there is a lack of integrational policies, and that's exactly what I have observed. A small number of Russian-speaking migrants have actually been able, apart from their professional work, to find very close, very deep connections with the society on the level of friendships, on the level of personal relations, except for certain concepts like profession or family, if they're married to someone from Japan. So from this point of view, Japan is more like a multicultural society with very strict borders amongst each culture in comparison to the US, where I think the pattern of melting pot more or less is existent. So that would be my comment.
Valerie, you want to add something, or Natalia? Maybe Valerie and Natalia, okay? Or not?
I didn't mean to jump in, but I was stimulated by the most recent comments. Speaking of the melting pot, which is one of my research subjects, I recently overheard a wonderful new definition or identification of the new American community developed by and coined by, gosh, I forgot the name of the comic and stand-up actor. I'll get there in a second, but he named the current American society Lunchables. Kind of the same lunchbox divided into tiny little compartmentalized communities. So it's another outdated stereotype. Everything is on the move as of the moment, and let's just keep tracing these changes and commonalities and differences. And I have a very strong belief that there will be more commonalities if we'll compare the Japan society and American society and the Russian-speaking diasporas thereof. Thank you. I am disappearing at this point.
Thank you very much.
Valerie, you want to add something?
I just would like to add some comments following Ksenia's impressions. Honestly, I was happy to spend about a year in Japan. After that, I have in my mind only a few words, and they are sumimasen. I can say this word every day. If I, for instance, push somebody on the street, I will say sumimasen, спасибо, извините, спасибо, something like that. I don't know what does it mean. It works in every situation in Japan. If you have some trouble, just say sumimasen and everything will be okay in Japan. And another word is gaikokujin, foreigner. This is two words I know quite well. And I was in Japan during about a year. I never was in private apartment of even my colleagues, and to say even my colleagues in Japan. This is absolutely different situation. They are very, very private people. You're right, absolutely. So sorry for my interruption.
Thank you very much. Yeah, it can be translated as anything. Thank you, excuse me, and go ahead. So thank you very much for this wonderful example, definitely.
Okay. Yeah, I think that our time is finished. I've got a lot of questions, but you know, as the I have no opportunity to get it about, for example, Czech criminals like in the shadow, because it's very different thinking about communism time check. But okay, I think that will be opportunity. We've got our email address and so on. Maybe it will be the next discussion during email or something like that. Okay, I think that we've got 1 hour break for the dinner or lunch or something like that. I don't know, it will be American lunch or not. So we've got time, and in 2:30 in Petersburg time we start another session. Thank you very much. Maria, you want to add something? No. Okay. Thank you very much, and see you next time. Bye.